Days of Thanksgiving was that day that Miriam celebrated God's parting of the Red Sea, and the people of Israel passed through it, and then the waters crashed down upon Pharaoh, and the people of Israel were now on their way to the Promised Land. But for we Americans, our idea of the original Thanksgiving Day came in 1621, when the great Indian king Massasoit brought 90 of his tribe members of the Wampanoag tribe to eat for 3 days a feast with the Pilgrims. Now, there's no mention that they ate turkey in that first Thanksgiving. There's only mention that they ate fish, plenty of venison, shellfish, a few vegetables, wild fowl, maybe turkey comes under wild fowl, berries. But if you were to read what William Bradford wrote about the first Thanksgiving, it had happened a year before, when the Pilgrims, after many weeks on this stormy Atlantic, came upon the shore there in what is now called Provincetown Harbor on Cape Cod, and William Bradford and the Pilgrims knelt down in the sand. And Bradford recalls praying in thanksgiving to God. For the Pilgrims, the Atlantic was the Sinai Desert. They identified so closely with what had happened in the Exodus that they believed that England was Egypt, and God had freed them from their bondage. And whether they were to die there in New England or live, they were thankful that God had delivered them. For they were now free to worship according to God, with God as being the head of their society. And they were no longer in bondage, and they were grateful. But some of us would say that the first Thanksgiving occurred in 1789, when the nation's first president, George Washington, declared a national day of Thanksgiving on November 26th. It was 2 years after the Constitution had been ratified, and there were difficulties in this new nation, and yet Washington was beginning to see a people forming. And he believed that with God's guidance, this nation should give thanks and praise. And so in his first Thanksgiving proclamation, as the first nation's president, he had a few things in mind for which to be thankful. First, that the nation should repent of its transgressions before God. And second, that the nation should thank God for what God had given them. And thirdly, that the nation should be committed to spreading the light of knowledge, of religion, and of virtue. But what Washington did in 1789 didn't occur annually. John Adams had Thanksgiving Day proclamations in 1798 and 1799. But Thomas Jefferson failed to have any Thanksgiving Day proclamations, perhaps because of his position on church-state separation. After the War of 1812, Congress petitioned James Madison to have a day of thanksgiving even though the White House had been burned by the British, and even though so many people had lost their lives, Madison agreed and called for 2 National Day of Thanksgivings in 1814 and 1815. But then the practice ended, and it wasn't until 1863 that Abraham Lincoln called for a National Day of Thanksgiving. This was the year, if you remember, that the Union had defeated the Confederates at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. And the tide of the war had begun to shift. And perhaps Lincoln felt now that he could thank God for something positive that had happened that might reunite the nation. But it may have been that you could say that the first Thanksgiving came a few days earlier than Lincoln made his proclamation. For on September 28, 1863, a woman wrote Abraham Lincoln imploring him, like she had implored 5 presidents before him, to have a National Day of Thanksgiving. Her name was Sarah Josepha Hale. She was the editor of Godey's Ladies book. This was a periodical that came out monthly, and she was one of the few women who was educated. Her brother, who had been educated at Dartmouth, taught her all that she knew, and she had taken that and had become quite a literary leader in the nation. And she implored Abraham Lincoln to reestablish something that she knew had been occurring in spotty moments before in American history. And Abraham Lincoln immediately called for a National Day of Thanksgiving. We've had one every year since. But you know, the Day of Thanksgiving doesn't require a presidential proclamation, does it? A Day of Thanksgiving occurs wherever there are people who remember that God is blessing them, and they choose of their own free will to give thanks to God for what He has done. And you know, throughout our nation's history, we have been a people who have handed down from one generation to another generation this responsibility of being thankful. Think about what it meant in 1928 to celebrate Thanksgiving. It was less than a month after the great stock market crash. And think about what it meant to have a day of Thanksgiving in 1942, a year after Pearl Harbor. And now young men and women weren't at home any longer. They were overseas, fighting for the peace and freedom of the world. And then think about what it meant for us to have a National Day of Thanksgiving after 9/11, and how we still gathered in our homes to thank God for the blessings of this great land, for His guidance over us, and to petition God that we might see justice from that terrible, terrible injustice we experienced. You know, Thanksgiving Day transcends prosperity or famine. It's not one moment in time, is it? It's whenever and wherever we gather as brothers and sisters of this great land remembering what God is doing in our midst, trusting and having faith that He is watching over us, He is blessing us, He is guiding us into an uncertain future. Thanksgiving begins wherever and whenever we share that conviction that brought William Bradford to his knees on that Cape Cod shore and brings the rest of us to our Thanksgiving tables this day. When we know deep within our hearts that we need not be anxious about anything, but in everything, with prayer and supplication, with thanksgiving, we make our requests known to God. And the peace of Christ, which passes all understanding, will keep our hearts and minds in Him.